I wasn't looking for the architectural secrets of the Vatican, nor was I setting out to unravel the mysteries of a lost global empire. I was just researching the logistical supply chains of 16th-century Renaissance paper mills, trying to understand how massive architectural projects sourced their raw drafting materials. I wanted to know the mundane details. How do you map out a dome that weighs tens of thousands of tons using only handmade parchment and charcoal? It was a simple, innocent question of logistics and engineering. But as I dug deeply into the digital archives, zooming in on high-resolution scans of the supposed original blueprints for St. Peter's Basilica, something began to feel deeply wrong. Look at this image on your screen. Look closely at the lines tracing the foundation. We are told these were drawn by hand, by men squinting by flickering candlelight, using rudimentary compasses and heavy wooden straightedges. But zoom in on the geometry. Notice the unsettling precision. The line weight is perfectly uniform across a span of 3 feet of aged parchment. The intersecting angles of the colonnades do not waver, not even by a fraction of a millimeter. This is not the organic, flawed, and breathing stroke of a human hand holding a quill. This looks like a machine output. This looks like an architectural CAD drawing printed in the 1500s. The official explanation is simple, neat, and contained. They tell us a succession of genius architects, Bramante, Raphael, Michelangelo, drew up these plans and handed them down to illiterate stonemasons, who then, using wooden cranes, horses, and hemp ropes, hoisted massive blocks of travertine limestone and marble to build the largest church in the world. It is a beautiful story of human triumph. It is a comforting narrative that fits perfectly into the textbooks we were given as children. But the official explanation collapses when you apply forensic engineering to the documents themselves. It presents a glaring mathematical contradiction. Consider the sheer volume of structural engineering required to balance a dome of that magnitude. To draft the blueprints for such a structure, you don't just need a singular, beautiful sketch. You need thousands of pages of structural calculations, load-bearing assessments, and material stress tests. Where are those documents? The Vatican Apostolic Library, one of the most heavily guarded and restricted archives on Earth, claims to hold the definitive history of human civilization. Yet the intermediate working papers, the trial and error, the failed math, the raw engineering data required to actually construct a building with surgical precision are entirely missing. The silence is deafening. We are shown only the final, perfect schematic, a schematic that, if you look at the lower right corner of this scan, bears the unmistakable marks of deep erasure, as if an older, different notation was systematically scraped away from the parchment before the Italian text was added. Let the camera pan slowly across the facade of the Vatican. Notice the sheer scale of the columns. Look at the people walking at the base. They look like tiny insects next to the massive, monolithic foundations. Why would you build doors that are 30 feet high? Are we to believe these were constructed purely for aesthetic grandeur, by people who traveled in wooden carts over muddy, unpaved roads? Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The proportions are entirely wrong for the human beings of that era. They are wrong for us now. The official record demands that we believe a civilization struggling with basic sanitation somehow erected geometric masterpieces that modern construction firms, equipped with laser-guided hydraulic cranes, would struggle to replicate today. And that brings us back to the restricted archives. If the narrative is true, the Vatican should proudly display every single scrap of paper documenting the decades of grueling, step-by-step construction. Instead, access is strictly controlled. Independent researchers are only allowed to see what has been pre-approved. What if the blueprints we are shown are not instructions for construction, but rather reverse-engineered schematics? What if they didn't build it at all? What if they just measured it, drew it, and claimed it? What if the real blueprints, the original documents detailing the true purpose of the copper domes, the acoustics of the basilicas, the energetic function of the Antiquitech are locked away deep within the 53 miles of subterranean shelving beneath the Vatican? If you are finding this investigation valuable, please subscribe to keep this research alive, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? Have you noticed these anomalies in your own streets? Let us break down the sheer, brutal mathematics of the official narrative. We are told that St. Peter's Basilica was constructed over a period of 120 years, beginning in 1506. Look at this archival photograph of the exterior columns, taken in the late 19th century before modern restorations smoothed away the truth. Zoom in on the joinery. Notice the seamless transitions between blocks of travertine limestone that weigh upwards of 60 tons each. The official record asks us to believe that men in wool tunics, using hand-forged iron chisels, carved these blocks at the quarries in Tivoli. It asks us to believe they then loaded these 60-ton behemoths onto wooden carts, dragged them over 20 miles of rutted dirt roads using oxen, floated them down the Tiber River on wooden barges, and then hoisted them hundreds of feet into the air using nothing but hemp rope and wooden treadwheel cranes. The math simply does not add up. A standard wooden cart of the era would collapse under a fraction of that weight. Hemp rope, no matter how thick, has a tensile strength that snaps under the load of a multi-ton limestone monolith suspended mid-air. But let us pretend, for a moment, that the transport was physically possible. Let us look at the labor force. The official narrative claims that an army of stonemasons, carpenters, and laborers worked in perfect, harmonious unison for over a century. Yet the logistical reality of the 16th century makes this a mathematical contradiction. How do you manage tens of thousands of illiterate workers across multiple quarries, transport routes, and a chaotic construction site without radios, without standardized global measuring systems, and without digitized blueprints? You cannot. A project of this magnitude, demanding this level of surgical precision, requires a centralized, instant communication network. It requires an industrial supply chain and a heavy machinery infrastructure that simply did not exist in the Renaissance. Now look upward. Let the camera pan slowly to the massive dome piercing the skyline. The official story credits Michelangelo with its design, a structure weighing an estimated 40,000 tons, composed of two massive shells of brick and stone. But look closer at the copper that once heavily adorned these structures, much of which has been stripped or replaced over the centuries. Copper is an elemental conductor. We are told it was chosen merely to keep the rain out, a decorative roofing material that oxidized into a beautiful green patina. But why source thousands of tons of a highly conductive metal at staggering expense for a simple roof? When you examine the geometric alignment of the dome, the copper cladding, and the metal spires extending into the atmosphere, it does not look like a place of conventional worship. It looks like an antenna. It looks like a machine. We must apply forensic materials science to what we are seeing. Inside the basilica, the acoustic properties are a literal impossibility for the era. If you stand precisely in the center under the dome, a whisper can be heard clearly across the vast marble floors. Historians claim this was a happy accident of the architecture, a coincidental byproduct of the vaulted ceilings meant to passively amplify choir chants. But true acoustic engineering requires advanced calculus. It requires a profound understanding of waveform dynamics and cymatics, the study of visible sound and vibration, that the builders supposedly did not possess. The geometric perfection of the vaulted ceilings acts as a meticulously designed resonant cavity. It is not an accident. It is tuned. It is a frequency amplifier built with a precision that absolutely defies the crude chisels and mallets we are told were used to carve it. And who exactly funded this? The Vatican claims it was paid for by the sale of indulgences, by the pennies of fearful peasants, and the donations of European monarchs. But calculate the modern equivalent of the raw materials alone. The millions of cubic feet of travertine, the flawless Carrara marble, the gold leaf, the copper, the bronze. We are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in today's currency, concentrated in a city that was, at the time, supposedly recovering from plagues and brutal military sackings, surrounded by a largely impoverished, agrarian society. The economic model is a mathematical contradiction. You cannot extract that much wealth from a fractured, disease-ridden Europe to build a mathematically perfect, sonically tuned, geometric energy center. Unless, of course, they did not build it. This is where the official explanation collapses entirely, and the truth, however unsettling, begins to emerge from the shadows of the Vatican's restricted archives. The blueprints they hide are not plans for construction. They are plans for excavation, adaptation, and minor modification. We didn't build this, we found it. The Renaissance was not a period of sudden, inexplicable human genius erupting organically from the Dark Ages. It was a period of recovery. It was a period of unearthing. Think of the hermit crab. A hermit crab wanders the ocean floor fragile and exposed, until it finds the abandoned shell of a much larger, more complex sea creature. It crawls inside, occupies the space, and claims it as its own. It did not secrete the calcium to build the flawless spiral. It does not understand the biology of the ancient creature that created it. It merely lives inside the ruins of a greater architecture, wearing it as a shield. We are the hermit crabs. Humanity, as we know it today, is a species of scavengers living in a grander civilization's shell. The Vatican did not commission the construction of St. Peter's Basilica from scratch. They inherited a Tartarian powerhouse, a surviving node of a global, decentralized energy grid. They occupied it, plastered their own historical iconography over the original geometric motifs, and sealed the true schematics, the stolen Tartarian blueprints, deep within their subterranean vaults. They locked away the knowledge of how the copper domes harnessed atmospheric ether, how the acoustic resonance was utilized, and how the massive stones were placed with an ease we cannot fathom today. They claimed the inheritance of a forgotten civilization and told us they built it with ropes and hammers. Once you see the impossibility of their story, the illusion shatters, and you realize you are looking at an occupied inheritance. If St. Peter's Basilica were the only structural impossibility on Earth, we might eventually find a way to rationalize it. We could convince ourselves that a singular, miraculous concentration of human genius occurred in Renaissance Italy, a brief flash of brilliance that vanished as quickly as it appeared. But the uncomfortable truth, the reality that forces us to look past the Vatican walls, is that this is not an isolated incident. The anomaly is not confined to the Italian peninsula. When you step back and examine the archival photographs of the world's major cities from the mid-19th century, a terrifying, beautiful consistency emerges. The pattern repeats, and it repeats with a precision that defies every timeline we have ever been taught. Let the camera pan away from Rome and cross the continent to St. Petersburg, Russia. Look at St. Isaac's Cathedral. Notice the massive, monolithic red granite columns, each weighing 80 tons, supposedly erected in the 1820s by serfs using wooden scaffolding in the freezing mud of a swamp. Now cross the Atlantic Ocean. Look at the United States Capitol building in Washington, D.C., or the various state capitals mirroring its exact design. Look at the copper-clad domes, the neoclassical facades, the heavy limestone blocks seamlessly joined without mortar. The official narrative claims these were built by a newly formed, financially strained nation using slave labor, horses, and wooden pulleys. Now look at Buenos Aires. Look at the Parliament House in Melbourne, Australia. Look at the general post offices in cities from Mumbai to Montreal. Zoom in on the architectural motifs. We are looking at the exact same arched doorways, designed for entities seemingly much larger than the average 19th century human. We are looking at the same intricate geometric floor plans that act as acoustic resonators. We are looking at the identical use of copper and zinc atop towering spires, reaching up into the atmospheric ether like dormant metallic fingers. The history books tell us this is simply the neoclassical or Beaux Arts style, a sudden global architectural trend where everyone, everywhere, simultaneously decided to mimic Greco-Roman antiquity using materials they could barely transport. But a trend does not explain the engineering. A trend does not explain how you lay foundations 30 feet deep into solid bedrock using wooden shovels and iron picks. Consider the logistics of this supposed global architectural movement. We are talking about the 1700s and 1800s. There were no digitized supply chains. There was no instantaneous communication. The transatlantic telegraph cable was not fully functional until the late 19th century. An architect in London could not send a structural modification to a stonemason in Melbourne without waiting months for a ship to cross the ocean. Yet, the buildings are identical down to the mathematical ratios of their sacred geometry, the joinery of the stonework, the load-bearing calculations of the vaults, the integration of water systems beneath the foundations. They are all identical. When you look at the sheer logistical nightmare of trying to synchronize the simultaneous construction of these massive, mathematically perfect stone structures across 6 continents, using primitive technology and fractured supply lines, the coordination problem becomes impossible to ignore. You cannot coordinate a global grid of impossible architecture using carrier pigeons and sailing ships. If X is true, that these nations were separate, technologically primitive, and disconnected, then Y must be false. They could not have independently designed and constructed the exact same hyper-advanced, energy-harnessing structures at the exact same time. The blueprints locked in the Vatican's restricted section are not just the schematics for one basilica in Rome. What if they are the surviving fragments of a universal architectural code? What if they are the remnants of a standardized global infrastructure? The pattern spreads even further when you look down from above. Examine the old maps of the so-called star forts. Look at Bourtange in the Netherlands. Look at the citadel of Lille in France. Look at Goryo-Kaku in Japan, or Fort Jefferson stranded in the ocean off the coast of Florida. We are told these were primitive defensive structures built to deflect cannonballs. But zoom in on the geometry. They are perfect complex fractals. They are star-shaped cymatic patterns carved into the earth with surgical precision, surrounded by meticulously engineered water channels. How did Tokugawa-era Japan and 17th century European monarchs independently decide to terraform the Earth into the exact same complex geometric shapes? They did not. The official explanation collapses. They found them. The people of the 18th and 19th centuries merely occupied the remaining nodes of a worldwide civilization. They dug them out of the mud, claimed the existing fortresses, claimed the existing capitals, claimed the existing cathedrals. They found a global grid of structures designed to interact with electromagnetism, water, and acoustic frequencies, and they repurposed them into post offices, government buildings, and asylums. We are wandering through the scattered bones of a unified global empire, a civilization that spanned from the steppes of Tartaria to the shores of the Americas, operating on a unified frequency. We look at these buildings every day. We walk up their massive stone steps. We gaze up at their silent, oxidized copper domes. We are told they are monuments to the slow, steady progress of recent human history, but the stones themselves tell a different story. The mathematics demand a different explanation. The silence from the institutions that guard the original documents is not the silence of ignorance. It is the silence of containment. They know the pattern repeats. They know the global symmetry cannot be explained by horses and chisels. Once you see the interconnected web of this lost architecture, the world you thought you knew dissolves. You realize that the entire modern narrative is a carefully constructed blanket thrown over the ruins of a stolen world. Let us return to the Vatican, to those 53 miles of subterranean shelving. If a global, unified architectural grid existed, if the impossible geometry we see across the world was part of a single, coherent system, then the true blueprints, the operating manuals for these cymatic resonators and atmospheric energy gatherers, must have been systematically collected and quarantined. You do not conquer a technologically superior civilization and leave their instruction manuals lying around for the surviving, disoriented population to find. You lock them away. You restrict access. And when independent researchers ask to see the unedited, pre-16th century structural ledgers, what happens? They are met with bureaucratic walls. The silence is deafening. We are given sanitized, copied sketches and told the originals are too fragile to be viewed by unauthorized eyes. But quarantining the paper trail is only half the coordination problem. How do you erase the physical footprint of an entire global empire? How do you make the occupants forget they are living in an inherited shell? You must introduce a reset. We must carefully consider the historical window between 1850 and 1920, not as an era of rapid, organic industrial progress, but as a deliberate period of clearing the board. If the narrative of slow, linear human evolution is true, then the events of the late 19th century must be a bizarre series of tragic coincidences. But if we hypothesize a coordinated reset, the anomalies suddenly align with terrifying precision. Look at the archival photographs of the Great Fires. Let the camera pan across the devastation of Chicago in 1871, Boston in 1872, Seattle in 1889, or San Francisco in 1906. We are told these were largely wooden cities that caught spark from a kicked lantern or a spilled stove. But zoom in on the rubble. These do not look like the ashes of pine and oak. They look like the bombed-out ruins of ancient Rome. You see massive, multi-story stone facades, heavy masonry, and iron columns gutted by temperatures that wood fires simply cannot sustain. Stone does not burn. Brick does not melt from a fallen lantern. Yet in city after city, these magnificent, heavy masonry structures were condemned, entirely demolished, and cleared away to make room for inferior, easily controlled modern construction. The fires were not tragedies of poor urban planning. They were controlled demolitions. They were the physical erasure of the old world, and what they could not burn, they temporarily rebranded. Look at the photographs of the Great World's Fairs. Look at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, or the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis. We are asked to believe that populations struggling with basic infrastructure, fresh out of the mud and horse-drawn era, built massive, sprawling, mathematically perfect neoclassical cities covering hundreds of acres. We are told they built artificial canals, illuminated everything with millions of early electric lights, and erected towering domes and statues, all in the span of 2 or 3 years. And the most unbelievable part of the official narrative? We are told they built them as temporary exhibits, using a mixture of plaster and hemp called staff, only to pack them full of dynamite and blow them to dust just months later. Let the logic of that sink in. Why would a financially strained society expend the modern equivalent of billions of dollars to build temporary palaces that rival the Vatican in scale and complexity, only to destroy them? If they had the engineering capacity to build these structures in 2 years, why did it take decades to build far simpler, uglier government buildings later on? The math contradicts the story. They did not build the world's fairs. They found them. These were existing Tartarian city centers, inherited and cleaned up for one final grand exhibition. They paraded the surviving populations through the grand courts to show them the majesty of the temporary world. Then they detonated the evidence to ensure the past could never be reclaimed. The erasure was surgical. Where buildings were too useful or too massive to destroy, they were subjected to historical rebranding. Look closely at the archways of the grand post offices and state capitals in your own cities. Notice where the stone seems shaved down, where an older crest or insignia has been visibly chipped away and replaced by a modern, clumsily carved date or a national eagle. They plastered over the sacred geometry. They stripped the copper from the domes under the guise of war efforts, effectively disabling the atmospheric energy antennae. They changed the names of the avenues, rewrote the founding charters of the cities, and assigned the construction of these masterpieces to a handful of prolific, yet strangely undocumented local architects. And what of the people who remembered? If you reset a civilization, you must deal with the biological memory. The late 19th century saw an unprecedented explosion of insane asylums and orphanages. Look at the train manifests of the orphan trains that shipped hundreds of thousands of nameless children across the American West. Where did this massive, sudden influx of parentless children come from? You separate the children from the oral history of their parents. You place them in grand, inherited stone orphanages, buildings that look like palaces but function as re-education camps. You teach them the new, approved timeline. You teach them that the men with the chisels built the domes. Today, the institutions guard this newly forged timeline with absolute hostility. When independent researchers point out the photographic evidence of the mud-flooded ground floors, the windows buried at street level suggesting massive terraforming or cataclysm, academia refuses to engage. They dismiss the physical evidence as mere street grading. They will not answer the logistical questions. They will not explain the supply chains. They will not open the restricted vaults beneath Rome to let us see the raw mathematical data of our own history. The silence is deafening. It is the silence of an occupying force that has successfully rewritten the deed to the earth. Imagine for a moment what those restricted documents actually depict. If the stolen Tartarian blueprints hidden beneath the Vatican are indeed the operating manuals for a global civilization, they describe a reality so beautiful it breaks the heart to merely conceptualize it. We are looking at the schematics of a true utopia. This was a world that did not violently extract its power from the earth. There were no coal mines blackening the lungs of children, no oil spills poisoning the oceans, no fracking cracking the bedrock. The architecture itself was the engine. The copper-clad domes, the gold-leafed spires, the intricate iron cresting that adorned every roofline. These were not decorative flourishes added to please the eye of a passing monarch. They were highly calibrated geometric antennae, designed to harvest the limitless electromagnetic ether of the atmosphere. The cities glowed with a soft, ambient luminescence, free and abundant. Now contrast that lost inheritance with the bleak, utilitarian reality we have been forced to accept as normal. Look at the modern skyline. We have replaced the sacred geometry and resonant limestone of the past with towering, soulless rectangles of glass and steel. We live and work in gray, brutalist concrete boxes that degrade our spirits and disconnect us from the natural frequencies of the earth. We string hideous, toxic wooden poles across our degraded neighborhoods, draping them with humming wires to meter and sell electricity back to ourselves at a premium. We navigate congested asphalt grids, breathing synthetic smog, working grueling hours just to pay for the right to exist in cramped, mass-produced shelters. We are told this is the absolute pinnacle of human evolution. We are told we should be grateful to have escaped the mud. But the contrast between the majestic, inherited architecture we walk past every day and the disposable structures we actually build is a psychological wound that never heals. This is the deepest tragedy of the global erasure. It is not just about falsified history books or misdated construction logs. It is about the spiritual theft of human potential. The people who engineered the acoustic perfection of the global basilicas, the architects who designed cities as massive cymatic resonators, understood the biological impact of frequency. They built environments that actively promoted cellular health, psychological harmony, and human abundance. The high ceilings, the massive archways, the integration of pure flowing water systems beneath the star forts, these were designed to elevate the human condition. And all of that was violently stripped away. It was cordoned off, detonated, or repurposed into the very institutions that now control us. We were robbed of a paradigm of abundance and forcefully downgraded into a paradigm of artificial scarcity and endless labor. When you stand in the center of one of these inherited structures, perhaps an old post office, or a surviving train terminal with its vaulted ceilings and massive skylights, you feel a profound, gnawing melancholy. It is the sadness of the hermit crab realizing the shell it occupies belongs to a ghost. We are living in a downgraded simulation of a world we were meant to inherit. The controllers of the 19th century reset did not just steal the technology, they stole our memory of what human life was supposed to be. They convinced us that illness, grueling toil, and aesthetic ugliness are simply the natural state of nature. They locked the true blueprints in the dark, restricted sections of their archives so we would never know that we were born to be the heirs of a majestic, energy-rich empire, not the indebted tenants of a concrete dystopia. But the human spirit is deeply intuitive, and our biology recognizes the mismatch. We feel the subtle, vibrational dissonance every time we compare the breathtaking beauty of a 19th century asylum to the depressing, flat drywall of a modern hospital. We look at the impossible marble veils of a Renaissance sculpture or the awe-inspiring weight of a monolithic column, and a primal part of our subconscious weeps for the truth. Once you understand the scale of this theft, your relationship with the physical world permanently changes. You can no longer walk down a historic street and simply admire the buildings as quaint relics of a bygone era. You begin to audit reality. You look at the heavy brass doors of a local bank, designed for giants, and you feel the phantom presence of the builders. You look at the basement windows buried beneath the concrete sidewalks, and you see the catastrophic mud flood that buried the old world. You look at the ornate lightning rods on a forgotten courthouse, and you see severed, silenced antennae. The illusion of the modern, linear narrative shatters against the heavy, undeniable masonry of the past. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. You are no longer a passive observer wandering blindly through the present. You are a mourner, a reluctant investigator walking through the beautiful, silent graveyard of a stolen utopia, waiting for the world to wake up. So what are we left with when we close the history books and look at the physical reality of the world we inherited? We are left with a massive, undeniable mathematical contradiction. We are left with 60-ton blocks of travertine limestone hoisted by non-existent machinery, acoustic resonators built by men who supposedly lacked the calculus to understand them, and 53 miles of subterranean Vatican archives that remain fiercely guarded against independent logistical analysis. We are left with a global pattern of identical, impossible architecture that spans continents, built during an era when global coordination was a physical impossibility. The official narrative asks for your absolute faith. It asks you to look at a majestic, copper-domed schematic engine and believe it was constructed by men in tunics using hand-forged chisels and wooden carts, simply because a sanitized piece of parchment says so. But true investigation doesn't require faith. It requires forensic measurement. It requires asking the hard, mechanical questions about supply chains, load-bearing physics, and the bizarre, synchronized erasure of the mid-19th century. Perhaps the blueprints hidden deep beneath Rome are exactly what they claim to be: fragile, mundane records of Renaissance stonemasons. But if that is the case, why the absolute secrecy? Why the deafening silence from the institutions when confronted with the basic logistical impossibilities of their own timeline. If the official story is true, it should withstand the most rigorous engineering audit. It should not need to be protected by layers of bureaucratic redaction. What if the true history of humanity isn't one of slow, painful progress from the mud, but rather a story of a magnificent peak, followed by a sudden, coordinated fall? What if the buildings we pass every single day are not monuments to our ancestors' hard work, but the grand, silent remnants of a civilization that was stolen from us? I cannot give you a definitive answer today. The final pieces of this puzzle are still locked away in the dark, but the question remains, echoing through the vaulted, resonant ceilings of the structures they left behind. If we didn't build this world, who did? And more importantly, who decided to erase them? The evidence is all around us, waiting for you to see it. If this video resonated with you, please like and share it to help break the algorithm's silence. Subscribe for the next part of the investigation. The truth is waiting.